Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the first part in a two-part series that I am calling Do or Do Not, as a not-so-covert nod to my favorite little green Muppet from Star Wars, because we are talking in this episode and the next one about a particular Latin root that basically gives us a whole bunch of words all over the English language. That root is the Latin root fock, and the Latin root fock is used in the verb, especially facere, that you can see on your screen. By the way, side note, all C's in Latin are hard C's. They always sound like a K and not an S, and that's why I'm pronouncing it facere and not facere or something like that. Now, the Romance languages do change these C's later on, but Latin still pronounced them like a K. So the Latin verb facere means to do or to make. As you can imagine, just like in any language, the verb that means to do or to make is very common because people are doing or making things all the time, including in English. Many languages use one verb for do and make, but in English we use two different verbs, and so that's something you tend to get used to if English is your native language and you learn another language. So the verb facere means to do or to make. The past participle of that verb was factum. You can still see the fock root there with a different ending, tum, which is the past participle ending. So essentially that is something that is done or made, and that's how we would translate the past participle into English there. So factum is done or made, and we are going to see some borrowings into English that have that T from the past participle, and then some others that don't have the T from the past participle. We've seen this on some previous episodes as well with some other Latin verbs that we have been dealing with. Latin could put other endings onto this root fock and make it into other parts of speech, such as their word facilis, which would mean literally doable, but we would often translate that as easy. So we're going to see some of these in use as we go on, but everything we look at in this episode and the next is going to be connected to the Latin root fock. Let's start with a really common word that we have in English today, which is, of course, the word fact that you see on your screen there. You can see that this is the Latin root fock plus the T ending of the past participle, because it actually just comes from that past participle factum, which, as just mentioned, means done or made. Literally, a fact, etymologically, is something that has been done or made or carried out, but of course, today, we use it to mean something that is true or real, and you can kind of see how that would evolve, because something that has been done in reality is therefore real. So that's sort of the evolution of that term. We've borrowed some Latin phrases that have this fact in it, and of course we still use them in English today, even though they are actually Latin phrases originally. For instance, people will throw around the phrase de facto all the time. That is actually a Latin phrase. It's not translated. We just kind of know what it means, and we use it maybe a little bit differently than the literal meaning in Latin, because the literal meaning is from that which has been done. We've been looking in the past several episodes at some of these little words in Latin, like de, some of these prepositions. De is a word that meant from or about or something like that. So de facto means from that which has been done. Of course, today we use it to mean in reality. So if we're talking about something being de facto whatever, that means in reality it's that, even if maybe other people say it's something else. Another Latin phrase that we use sometimes that you may hear that has the fox root in it is ipso facto. We pronounce it ipso facto, of course. In English today, they would pronounce it ipso facto or something more like that. Ipso is a pronoun that means like the very, or it's intensive or sometimes reflexive in some way in Latin. So ipso facto means by the very thing which has been done. And in English, we use this almost as a way to say therefore. If you use ipso facto in a sentence, a lot of times you can actually just replace it with the word therefore, because you're saying by the very thing that has been done, this other thing is accurate. So you can say, therefore, this thing is accurate. But that is literally what the term means in Latin. Perhaps the least common of these three that we're going to look at is the Latin phrase ex post facto, which has two of these prepositions at the beginning, ex and post. Ex means out of, post means after. So when you put those two things together with facto or facto in Latin, it means from that which was done after. And we use this to mean retroactive, essentially. So if somebody passes an ex post facto law, it means that you're retroactively making something illegal. And this is generally frowned upon as being an unjust thing to do, certainly in many countries' jurisprudence today, but that is literally what it means. So you can see that we get a lot of words from the Latin word factum. One language that, among others, that descends from Latin among the Romance languages today is the French language. And the French language, as you may know, is particularly important for the English language because we have gotten a bunch of words in English from the French language, and French just got them from Latin. So there are actually quite a few words, and we're going to look in the next few slides at a number of words that come through French from this Latin root, but may look a little bit different because there have been some mutations of the way this word looks and sounds as it passed through the French language. So for instance, the Latin word factum evolved into the French, what originally would have been pronounced fight. The spelling in French is archaic, which means that it used to be pronounced that way, but is no longer. So if you know modern French, you know this is pronounced fait today with basically a silent T and the AI run together to a monophthong. But this is the Latin word factum, all right? It just means something done. We have borrowed a couple of things from this. For instance, our English word feat, F-E-A-T, that you can see on your screen means a deed or something that has been done. This is actually just a borrowing from that French word. And by the way, I should tell you that pretty much all of the borrowings that we're going to look at in this episode come from an older stage of French, because French had its biggest influence on the English language from about the 11th to the 15th century, starting in the year 1066 when a French-speaking king, William the Conqueror, invaded England and took it over and brought the French language to England to basically be the language of government and commerce and many other upper class things. So that was the era when we English speakers borrowed a lot of French. And so we borrowed an older stage of French, not necessarily modern French. And also William the Conqueror was not speaking Parisian French. He was speaking his own dialect as well, Norman French, and that's going to affect some things as well. Now, one phrase that we have actually borrowed pretty recently from a modern dialect of French is this phrase right here that sometimes, kind of like some of those Latin phrases we were just looking at, we sort of throw this around even though it's French and we sort of just know what it means. This is a fait accompli, which you can probably just see in the French, even if you don't know French, means an accomplished deed. That's all it means. So in English today, if somebody tells you that something is a fait accompli, they're trying to tell you that that ship has sailed, we can't undo it, it's already done, because that's literally what the French means. So it's good to know some French phrases because they are bouncing around in English. Let's talk about some other words that are from French, but ultimately from this Latin fock root. The Latin factura has another suffix on the end that's like a noun suffix. We don't need to go too much into the weeds of Latin morphology, but essentially the Latin word factura meant something that has been made, or like a formation, because a formation is something that has been made at some point. And then French evolved factura into faiture, which is like a shape or a form. And you might be able to guess what English word we get from this that we use all the time. That's right, feature just comes from the French faiture, which comes from Latin factura, because of course today a feature is a part of something or someone's shape or form. If a movie is featuring somebody, it's a very important part of that movie's shape or form or appearance or whatever you want to call it. And so all of this goes back to this Latin word factura. What about another Latin word that comes off of the fock root? This is the Latin word factione, and notice there's a dash because you would put endings on that in Latin, so like factionem, factioni, but we don't need to worry too much about that. This was just a noun that meant a making or a doing or something like that. And this faction evolved into French façon, which means and meant appearance or style. It's the way that something is made or shaped or looks or whatever. So you can see how that semantic evolution would have happened. And appropriately, what word do we get from this French word façon? That's right, fashion, fashion, if you want to pronounce it in the French way. Fashion is a style, a manner, a custom. If we talk about something being fashionable, we mean that it's in style, right? So you can see where we would get that from. And again, this all goes back to the Latin noun factionem or factioni or whatever ending you want to put on that. Keeping with the theme of French words that are coming from Latin that are going to end up in English, you could put an ending onto the Latin root fock, an ending like abilis, and get something like foccabilis. It's more complicated than that, but ultimately this develops into French as something like faisable, which meant doable, possible, easy. And then what do we get in English from this French word? That's right, feasible. If you say that something is feasible in English, it means that it's possible or doable, or at least that you can figure out a way to get it done. That's what it means for something to be feasible. And again, this also goes back to the Latin fock root. Now, the infinitive of this verb in Latin, fock, was facere, which just meant to do or to make. We've already discussed that. And then French actually eroded facere to one syllable, faire. And that means to do in French. We've borrowed a phrase from modern French, relatively modern French, that has this infinitive in it. And that is, the way that we pronounce this in English, at least today, is laissez faire. If something is laissez faire, this is actually a direct borrowing from the French language. In French, this is actually a whole sentence. It means allow to do. Let somebody do something. Let some people do something. That's basically what laissez-faire means in French. Again, when we say something is laissez-faire in English, we're actually using it as a noun, not a whole sentence, or maybe an adjective if it's describing an economic system, because it is an economic system that emphasizes freedom. It says, let people do things, don't get in their way, and that's what we call laissez-faire economics. But it has that infinitive faire in it from French that goes back to the Latin infinitive facere that meant to do. So as you can see, this Latin root is actually lurking all over the place in our language, and many of the places that it's lurking, at least that we've been looking at so far, come through French. French has changed it, French has eroded it or evolved it, and therefore disguised it a little bit. But once you see it, hopefully you won't unsee it. Let's talk about some words that don't come through French, but come more directly from Latin, and so don't have that intermediate French influence. What about the word factor in English today? This comes from the Latin word factor. It has fock at the beginning, and you already know what that means. Tor is what we call an agent noun suffix. So you put it onto something and it says that it's somebody who does the first part. So it kind of makes sense that a factor in Latin would be somebody who does something, somebody who carries out some action. An agent, actually agent comes from another word in Latin, ago, that means to do or to drive forward some kind of action. And action comes from the same root as agent as well. So a factor was a doer in different contexts. And of course, today we use this word in English to mean someone or something that does something. I know that's a very general definition because there are all different kinds of factors, but they all come down to that. If you make a decision and you're saying there's several factors in which decision you're making, that means that there are several things that are active in causing you to make one decision or another. A few hundred years ago, mathematics took this term up, and of course today, if you learn mathematics, you learn about factors as well, because those are numbers that are active. They are doing something. As you can see, this all goes back to this Latin word factor that just means somebody that's doing something, basically. You can probably guess that the word factory comes right off of this as well, because of course a factory is a place for doing or making something, although quite interestingly, the original meaning of this term when it was invented a little under 500 years ago was actually a place for factores, or people who do things, to meet, and the original meaning of that word in English, factor, was actually a merchant or a business person. So a factory was like a place that people could meet and do business, and eventually it came to mean a place where people could meet and work on things to sell, and that's where we get our modern definition of the word factory from. What about faction? Faction also comes directly from Latin without some kind of French intermediation, as you can tell from the fact that it still looks a lot like the Latin word factio. A factio in Latin was a group of people acting together. This was used in two major ways back in Roman times. One of them was political, and one of them was sports. A factio would actually be a chariot team, because chariot racing was one of the big sports that they practiced and played in the Roman Empire. But it could definitely be be used in political terms, just like it is today when we talk about different factions in a particular country. There is definitely a political or ideological component to that usually, and so you can see that ancient Roman meaning of faction has sort of stuck with us. It's a group of people who are doing the same thing, who are moving toward the same goal, and that's how this comes from the fock root in Latin. Let's talk about another word, facile. This might not be a word that you use all the time, but you learn some good English words when you are learning some of this Latin vocabulary. So facile comes from the Latin adjective facilis that we actually talked about at the beginning of this episode. Facilis means easy or doable because it has that fock root at the beginning there. And so today in English, if you call something or someone facile, that could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing depending on the context. It can be good in the sense that it's simple and easy, or mild-mannered if it's a person or something like that. But a lot of times this word has taken on a negative valence, negative characteristics that mean like too easy for what it should be. So if you ask the meaning of life and I tell you, I don't know, 42 or something like that, you might accuse me of giving you a facile answer because I've given you an easy answer to a very complex question, and therefore I didn't do my homework, or I didn't give you an answer that you deserved. So a lot of times we use this word negatively to mean oversimplified, but it all goes back to this Latin word facilis that did mean easy or doable. Of course, we get the word facility from the fock root in Latin. This comes from the Latin noun facilitas, which actually meant easiness. It was an abstract noun. And then this actually did come through French, which dropped the ending a little bit, and it ended up with facilité, and that's the version that we have ultimately borrowed into English. Now, the original meaning of facility, even in English, when we borrowed it, was just easiness. And sometimes people still use it this way. Like somebody might say that you have a facility for playing football. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that before, but that means you're skilled at it. You're good at it. It's easy for you. And so we still use the word facility in that context today. However, pretty early on in English, several hundred years ago, it evolved from easiness to the physical means of doing something. And then it evolved one step further to mean a place for doing something. So a place that's set up to make it easier to do something, and therefore increasing the easiness of doing something. I think this is probably the most common way that we use the word facility today in the English language. We don't use it to mean easiness, although occasionally we do, but 99 times out of 100, probably when you hear the word facility today in English, you're talking about a building, an installation, a place that something gets done. That's a facility, and it all goes back to this root that has something to do with doing. Of course, coming off of facility is the verb facilitate, because if you facilitate something, you're just making it easy, or at least easier than it would have been otherwise. If someone tells you they want to facilitate you becoming someone who makes videos on YouTube, that means they're going to help you. They're going to make it easier for you, and that's what facilitate means, helping somebody get something done. What about faculty? This is another word that has multiple meanings today in the English language. This comes from the Latin word facultas, which just meant ability, the ability to do something, which is of course how it is connected to the do root. This also came through French faculté, and that's where we get the shape of the word faculty today. This word originally did mean just ability, even when we borrowed it into English, and then it came to mean the ability to do something, therefore the know-how. So if you have the know-how, you have the faculty, and we still use this word in this sense sometimes, the ability or knowledge to do something. So if we talk about your faculties of reason, we're talking about your ability to do something or your knowledge. However, the word has evolved further in the English language, and one of the most common ways that we use the word faculty today is to refer to individuals, usually who work at an institute of higher education, because they are individuals who have knowledge. So if we talk about the faculty of a particular university, The knowledge of the university is stored in all of those people's brains. The ability to get stuff done or to think through things is stored within all of those people. In other words, they can do a lot of stuff when their powers are combined, and that's why we call the employees, and not just any employees, but the professors and people like that at a university, we call them faculty for that particular reason. What about all of these words in English that end in fy, such as certify? You may never have thought where this if-I suffix comes from, but this if-I suffix actually comes from the fock root. So we are going to discuss it here and round out this episode talking about this suffix that actually comes from facere in Latin. Even in Latin, they were making compounds with the fock root. As you've probably noticed if you've been watching this channel a little while, Latin was a language that liked to make compounds, as many languages do. So in Latin, they actually already had a word 2,000 years ago, certificare. The certe part comes from the Latin adjective certus, which means certain. Of course, we get the word certain from that adjective in Latin today. And then the facere part is facere. So you put those two together, it's pretty simple. The verb means to make certain, or to make fixed, or to make sure. And that's essentially what it means to do this particular verb. In French, Old French in particular, this became certifier, and we borrowed that as certify. Ultimately, we chopped off the verb ending, the infinitive ending there in French, the er part, and we just ended up with certify. So that if-I ending, whatever verb you find that on in the English language, comes from Latin facere through French, which again eroded it, dropped the C, and then we ended up dropping the verb ending as well. So how do we use the word certify in English today? Well, it hasn't really changed that much in 2,000 years. It still basically means to make certain or to make sure. We use it to mean something, that we're going to guarantee something or to make something official. And of course, the past participle of that, something that has been made official, is a certificate, and there's that T at the end that comes from that Latin past participle ending that we saw on factum. The T in the tomb is the same T that you see here in certificate. So something that has been certified is a certificate. It's just a thing made certain. Of course, today we use this as a noun to refer to some official, document or something like that that guarantees that something has happened or has been done. All of this goes back to the fock root in Latin. Let's briefly talk about a whole bunch of other if-I words that we have in English that all come from this facere or facere suffix in Latin. Verify comes from the Latin, of course, fock root plus the Latin word for truth or true. And so verify means something similar to certify. It means to guarantee or to figure out if it's true or to just make it true by investigation. And so that's where that comes from. Nullify comes from another Latin word nullus, which means nothing. So nullify literally means to make nothing or to undo, to make it as if it never happened. And that's essentially what it means to make something nothing. That's what it means to nullify something. What happens if you notify somebody of something? The no part at the beginning is actually a root that we have already talked about on this channel quite a while ago. It's a root that means to know, or as a noun, knowledge in Indo-European. And so to notify someone means to make them aware, to make them in the know about something. And of course, that's what happens when you notify somebody of something. And then gratify comes from the Latin adjective gratus. We get words like grace from this and gracious, and the Spanish word gracias, which means thank you. So that word in Latin means pleased or happy or thanked or thankful. So if you gratify somebody, you're making them happy, you're making them pleased, you are giving them what they want. Just a few more here. Satisfy comes from the Latin word satis, which means enough. So if you satisfy somebody, you are giving them enough that they are happy. Maybe not giving them as much as you could, that's not the point. You're giving them enough, and that's literally what it means to satisfy somebody or something. Modify comes from the Latin root mode, which actually is connected to middle. We have words like mode in math that have something to do with, if not the average, then the middle of a whole group. So the original meaning of this word wasn't just to change it, but it was to bring it to the center of something, bring it toward the average, to make it more measured and less extreme. But today we usually use the word modify in the general sense of just changing something, even though that wasn't the original meaning of the word. How about qualify? Qual comes from a family of Latin words that have something to do with characteristics. They can be in questions, they can be question words, like of what sort is something. Of course, it's related to words like quality. The quality of something is what it's made of, what sort of thing it's made of, essentially. So if you qualify, you are making something of a certain sort, and not just any sort, but a sort that it needs to be. So if you qualify for an Olympic event, you have done what it takes. You have checked the boxes to make it into that Olympic event. You have been proven to be the kind of person that is able to be in that Olympic event, and that's what the word qualify means. Finally, one of my favorites, petrify. Actually, the petra part comes from the Greek word for rock or stone, connected to the word Peter. And so if you petrify someone, you probably have never done this before unless Medea is watching this episode. So petrify basically means to turn somebody into stone. Literally, if you are petrified, you are turned into stone, which means that you're like frozen in place and you can't do anything because you are so afraid. Of course, we use this term metaphorically today. Lots of people say they're petrified, and they are not, in fact, turned into stone when they say that, nor are they necessarily frozen as if they were turned into stone. But that is what the phrase and the word comes from etymologically. So it's fun to know the etymology of some of these terms. All right, we're going to stop there. In part 2, we're going to look at prefixes that could be put on the fock root. So we just looked at some suffixes, things that get put on the end, like the if-I, where it acts as a suffix. We're going to look at prefixes where it's not really a suffix, it's the main root, but you can put prepositions on the front of it. Some of these Latin prepositions that we've been looking at in the past few episodes, we're going to see how those work to get words like effect out of it. See you then.